Hello everyone, and welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. Before we begin, I want to let you know that during the first 15 minutes, there will only be a few ads, and after that, the listening will be completely uninterrupted. I chose to do this to give you a better experience. Even though it has greatly reduced the channel's earnings, I'd still like to ask for a little support. Subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they are essential to help the channel grow and allow me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let us dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The line was always there, a razor's edge of shadow cutting across the polished marble floor of the foyer. On one side, the warm, buttery glow from the library. On the other, the cool blue dusk seeping through the tall windows from the garden. Brooklyn Van Allen had crossed it 10,000 times. A girl moving from light to dark and back again without a thought. But that evening, as she paused, one bare foot on the warm stone, the other on the cool, the line did not feel like a boundary. It felt like a gap, a thin place, as if the floor there had been worn down by more than footsteps, as if the very division between the safe, gilded interior of her life, and the vast whispering outside had grown porous, uncertain. She shivered, though the air was still. It was the last clear thought she had before the world broke. The kidnapping was not subtle. It was a car, a bag, a chemical smell like overripe almonds, a voice, low and graveled, saying, "Easy now, princess, easy." Then, nothing but the rumble of an engine and the sense of being a small, fragile thing in a large, dark space. She woke in a room that smelled of damp concrete, old motor oil, and something else, something sweetly metallic beneath it all, like a penny held on the tongue. The light was a single, bare bulb behind a wire cage, throwing a stark, unforgiving geometry of shadows. The line here was not between light and dark, but between the small pool of illumination around the stained mattress where she lay, and the profound blackness that swallowed the corners of the room. This boundary felt absolute, until a man stepped out of the dark and into the light. He was tall, with a lean, corded strength, and a face that seemed carved from weathered wood. His eyes were the flat, cold gray of a winter lake. This was Dennis. He did not speak at first. He simply looked at her, his gaze inventorying her fear like a man assessing livestock. When he finally moved, it was to place a bottle of water and a plastic-wrapped sandwich on an upturned crate. "Your father is a rich man," he said. His voice was the sound the gravel made under the tires. "He's going to pay to get you back. You be quiet, you be still. You get to go home. You understand the line?" She nodded, the motion jerky. She understood lines. The line of his mouth. The line between compliance and punishment. The line between this moment and the next. The plan, as Dennis explained it to the others in low tones just beyond the edge of her hearing, was simple, clean. A number, a drop, an exchange. A fortune for a daughter. But plans are drawings on water. The first ripple came with Kingston. He was Dennis opposite in every way. Compact, coiled, with a restless energy that seemed to vibrate the air around him. His eyes were not cold. They were hot, dark, and hungry. He was the one who brought her food, who checked her ropes, who lingered. He didn't just see a ransom ticket. He saw a doll. A perfect, breakable doll from the world that had always kept its windows rolled up as it passed him by. "Brooklyn," he would whisper, his breath smelling of mint and tobacco. "That's a borough. That's a bridge. That's a place with grit. You don't look like grit." He would trace the line of her jaw with a calloused finger, not quite hurting her, but leaving the threat of it on her skin like a brand. She learned to be still under his touch, a rabbit sensing the fox. But in that stillness, something strange began to grow. It was not Stockholm Syndrome, not some simple transference of affection. It was a dreadful, silent understanding of power. Dennis' power was transactional, remote. Kingston's was intimate, absolute. In the hierarchy of this damp hell, Kingston, for all his sickness, held a terrible authority. And in a world reduced to a single room, authority was the only currency that mattered. The other two, Leo and Manny, were ghosts of muscle and nervous sweat. They jumped at sirens, argued about football, counted imaginary money. They were men who had seen a line and dared to cross it, only to find themselves lost on the other side, looking back with longing at their own mediocre lives. Their fear was a sour smell in the room. Days bled into nights marked only by the shifting of guards and the distant, mournful cry of a freight train. Brett Van Allen, on television screens in bars and airports, was a monument to crumbling power. His pleas were perfectly crafted, his agony visible in the tremor of his hands. But his eyes were the eyes of a general who has lost the map to the battlefield. He could move markets, but he could not move the shadows that held his daughter. The police, a faceless force of procedure and static, swarmed the edges of the case like flies on glass, unable to get in. The change began with a mistake, a missed call. A police cruiser spotted near the designated drop site, spooking Dennis' daughter. The clean plan was now smudged. The tension in the concrete room tightened, a wire thrumming. It was Kingston who snapped first. Manny Jittery had spilled a can of gasoline while siphoning from the getaway car. The reek filled the space. "You stupid kid," Kingston hissed, and he didn't shout. His voice dropped to a venomous purr. "You think this is a game? You think her daddy's gonna hand over a briefcase full of sunshine while you smell like a refinery?" He backhanded Manny. The crack was shockingly loud. Manny went down, a surprised sob catching in his throat. Brooklyn, curled on her mattress, flinched, but she also watched. She saw the fear in Manny's eyes, the quick, eager nod of Leo, desperate to stay on the safe side of Kingston's rage. She saw Dennis, from the doorway, watching Kingston with a new, calculating stillness. The line between leader and lieutenant had blurred. The violence had turned inward. That night, Kingston brought her a better blanket. He sat on the edge of the mattress. "You saw that," he said. "It wasn't a question. You see how it is. Weakness gets you hurt. You need a protector in here." His hand came to rest on her ankle, a possessive weight. "I can be that, or I can be what happens to you." In the cage of his gaze, Brooklyn felt a door within herself swing open, revealing a cold, dark room she never knew existed. She did not pull away. She gave a single, slow nod. It was not surrender. It was a negotiation. In that moment, she crossed her own line from pure victim to something else, something complicit. The power shifted, molecule by molecule. Dennis saw it. He saw the way Kingston's attention had crystallized around the girl, saw the distraction, the sick obsession. The ransom was still the goal, but now there were two problems: the police and Kingston. The plan required simplicity. Obsession was a complexity. Dennis began speaking to Leo and Manny in hushed tones when Kingston was asleep, his words weaving a new narrative where Kingston was the liability, the loose cannon who would sink them all. The massacre began not with a shout, but with a sigh. Dennis had decided. The new drop was set. They would take the money, but they would not split it 4 ways. 3 was cleaner. And they certainly wouldn't split it with the man who looked at their ticket to freedom like it was his own private toy. Kingston, perhaps sensing the shift, grew more volatile. He tied Brooklyn's hands too tight, leaving red bracelets on her wrists. He fed her with a rough, impersonal urgency. "Soon," he muttered, to her or to himself. "Soon it'll be just a memory." She didn't know if he meant the captivity or her. The night before the drop, the rain came. It drummed on the corrugated metal roof of the warehouse, a sound like 1,000 frantic fingers. It was in this symphony of water that Dennis made his move. He sent Manny to check the perimeter. As the young man shrugged on his jacket and stepped into the storm-washed darkness beyond the door, Dennis picked up a tire iron. He followed. The sound of the rain swallowed everything, until it didn't. There was a wet, choked cry, shorter than a breath, and then only the rain again. Dennis returned alone, his face a mask of calm, the tire iron dark and glistening. He looked at Leo, who had gone pale as bone. "Weakness," Dennis said, echoing Kingston's word from days before. Leo understood the new line. He nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing. Kingston was asleep on a cot in the corner. He slept like a cat, lightly, one eye almost open. He saw Dennis approach with the tire iron. He was faster. He rolled, a gun appearing in his hand like a magic trick. The first shot took Leo in the throat, a spray of crimson against the concrete wall. The second shot went wide as Dennis lunged, the tire iron swinging down. It had connected with Kingston's gun hand with a crunch of bone. The gun clattered away. The two men became a single, grunting, thrashing beast on the floor. Brooklyn watched from her mattress, her body frozen, her mind preternaturally clear. This was the brutal game, and she was the pawn that had tipped the board. The lines were gone. There was no light and dark, no inside and out, only the red reality of the fight. Kingston, despite his broken hand, was a feral thing. He found a shard of glass from a broken bottle and drove it into Dennis' thigh. Dennis roared, brought the tire iron down on Kingston's head. Once, twice, a sound like a melon dropped from a height. Then, silence, broken only by the ragged saw of Dennis' breath and the relentless rain. He stood, bleeding heavily from his leg, over Kingston's still form. Leo was already gone, his dead eyes reflecting the caged bulb. The room was a charnel house. The clean plan was now a masterpiece of gore. Dennis turned. His cold gray eyes found Brooklyn. In them, she saw the final calculation. The ransom was still possible. But a witness to this? A witness who had seen him break the ultimate line? He limped toward her, the tire iron dragging a faint red trail on the concrete. This was the moment. The line was before her. On one side, the passive victim, waiting for the blow. On the other, something unspeakable. Her eyes darted, not in fear, but in strategy. She saw it, half hidden under Kingston's cot. His gun. Dennis was hurt, slow. The power was there, on the floor, waiting. As he raised the iron, she did not scream. She moved. She rolled from the mattress, her bound hands reaching, scrambling. Her fingers closed around the cold, checkered grip. She had never held a gun. It was heavier than she imagined. She turned, sitting on the filthy floor, and pointed it at the man looming over her. Dennis stopped. He blinked, as if seeing her for the first time. The naive heiress was gone. In her place was a creature of this same dark, a creature he and Kingston had made. A faint, bloody smile touched his lips. "Go on then, princess," he breathed. "Cross it." She pulled the trigger. The sound was immense, final. It swallowed the rain, swallowed the past, swallowed her. Dennis folded, a look of profound surprise on his face, and joined the others on the wrong side of the line. The police found her there an hour later, guided by the frantic, traced call from Brett Van Allen's millions. She was sitting against the wall, the empty gun in her lap, Kingston's blanket around her shoulders. She was staring at the line of blood that had seeped from Dennis' body and stopped just short of her bare feet. The lead detective, a weary man named Crow with eyes that had seen too many rooms like this, crouched before her. He saw the dead men. He saw the living girl. He saw the precise, terrible geometry of the scene. He spoke softly, asking her what happened. She told a story of a fight, of monsters turning on each other, of a girl who cowered and survived. She left out the weight of the gun, the coolness of the grip, the deliberate way she had aimed. She left out the negotiation, the understanding, the silent pact with darkness. She painted herself back into the light. Crow listened. He looked at her hands, clean. He looked at her eyes, which were not those of a shattered victim, but of a serene, empty mirror. He looked at the trail of her footprints in the dust, which did not only flee from the violence, but circled it, approached it. He saw the truth, not as a shock, but as a quiet, dreadful pattern completing itself. He had come to find a victim and rescue her from the dark. But he saw that the dark had not just touched her. It had answered something in her. It had shown her a line, and she had learned to walk it, then to erase it. He did not arrest her. The evidence sang the song she composed. He helped her to her feet, guided her out of the room of death, across that first threshold into the blinding, chaotic light of sirens and shouts. Her father wept, crushing her to his tailored suit. Cameras flashed, capturing the miracle. Later, in the sterile calm of the hospital corridor, Crow watched her through the doorway of her private room. She sat by the window, staring out at the city lights, a silhouette against the glass. She was no longer looking at boundaries. She was looking at the whole vast, indifferent map of the night. And she knew now that she contained parts of it. He had come to solve a kidnapping, to draw a line between the innocent and the guilty. But the world, he understood now, was not like his reports. It was like that first foyer he'd seen in the Van Allen mansion, a place of shifting light and shadow, where the lines on the floor were just suggestions, worn thin by all the crossing. His role was not to judge which side she was on. His role was to bear witness to the fact that for some, the line itself is the crime. He met her reflection in the window glass. For a fraction of a second, their eyes held. No shock, no accusation, just a silent, mutual acknowledgement of the terrible truth they now both carried. Then he turned, walked down the bright, clean hallway, and left her to her new, unbounded world. The silence in the hospital room was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the dense, swallowing quiet of the warehouse, but a thin, high-pitched quiet, the sound of a world holding its breath. The doctors had come and gone, their words soft and careful, treating her like a glass figurine. Her father had finally been persuaded to go home, to shower, to prepare for the press conference that would declare his daughter's safe return a testament to faith and the excellence of law enforcement. He kissed her forehead, his tears warm on her skin, and she had smiled the faint, fragile smile they all expected to see. When the door clicked shut behind him, the smile faded, not into distress, but into a perfect neutrality. She rose from the bed, the stiff hospital gown whispering against her legs, and walked to the window. The city below was a circuit board of light, paths and connections, barriers and bridges. She used to see it as a skyline. Now she saw it as a diagram of control, of lines drawn and lines crossed. A soft knock came at the door. It wasn't a nurse. Their knocks were brisk, functional. This was tentative. "Come in," she said, her voice a little rusty from disuse. The door opened, and a young woman slipped inside. She was maybe 25, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a tablet clutched to her chest. She wore a visitor's badge, but her clothes were expensive, quietly so. "Miss Van Allen? I'm so sorry to disturb you. My name is Elise. I work for your father's legal team." Brooklyn said nothing, just watched her. Elise cleared her throat, nervous, under the placid gaze. "There are some documents for the official statement, and There's a matter of a personal item recovered from the scene. The police released it to us." She held out a small, clear evidence bag. Inside was a simple, cheap hair tie, the kind she'd used to pull her hair back the day she was taken. It was stained, a dull brown. "They found it near one of the men," Elise said, her voice dropping. "We thought you might want it, or we can dispose of it." Brooklyn took the bag. The plastic was cool. She didn't see a hair tie. She saw Kingston, his hot, dark eyes, the way he'd sometimes gathered her hair in his hands, not gently, but with a possessiveness that felt like the only real thing in that room. A token, a proof of transaction. She looked at Elise. "Thank you. Was there anything else?" Elise hesitated, then tapped her tablet. "The statement is prepared. It says you were kept in the dark, literally and figuratively, that you have no memory of the final events, that you are focused on healing and grateful to be home. It's what your father and the PR team recommend." "I'm sure it is," Brooklyn said. "Is it accurate?" Elise asked, the question braver than she was. Brooklyn's eyes drifted back to the city lights. "Accurate." The word was a line itself. "It's a story that will be told," she said finally. "You can tell them I agree." Elise nodded, relieved, and made to leave. At the door, she paused. The detective, Crow, he was asking unusual questions during the handoff. Not about the men, about you, about how you seemed. A faint, almost imperceptible current moved through Brooklyn's stillness. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him you were remarkably strong," Elise said. And then she was gone. Alone again, Brooklyn opened the evidence bag. She tipped the hair tie into her palm. The stain was definitely blood. She didn't know whose. Dennis? Kingston's? Leah's? It didn't matter. It was all the same now. She walked into the private bathroom, flipped on the light, and looked at herself in the mirror. The girl who had paused at the line in the foyer was gone. The face that looked back was older, composed. The eyes were the eyes from the warehouse window reflection, the ones Crow had seen. They were not haunted. They were informed. She turned on the tap, held the hair tie under the water, and watched the water run pink, then clear. She squeezed it dry, then pulled her hair back with it, securing the ponytail with a practiced twist. The action felt neither symbolic nor morbid. It felt practical. It was a reclamation of a tool. She returned to the window. Down in the hospital driveway, she saw a lone figure leaning against an unmarked sedan, the glow of a cigarette punctuating the dark. Crow, he wasn't looking up at her window. He was just waiting, watching the exits. He knew she had pulled the trigger not in a blind, desperate spasm, but with a chilling clarity. He knew her story was a clean, convenient line drawn over a messy truth. And his silence was not absolution. It was a different kind of pact. He was a man who dealt in facts. And the fact was, the world was better with those 3 men dead. The fact was, the heiress was a more useful creature as a symbol of resilience than as a study in moral contamination. He was drawing his own line, and on his side of it, her secret was safe. For now, Brooklyn understood. Everything was a negotiation. Everything was a line, drawn in sand, waiting for the tide or the will to erase it. She felt no triumph, no guilt, only a vast and quiet capacity. The world thought it was returning a stolen girl to her gilded life. But they were wrong. They were returning a sovereign to her kingdom. She turned off the bathroom light, leaving the room in darkness save for the city's glow. She did not sleep. She stood at the window, on no side of any line, and began to plan. The first plan was simple: visibility. She allowed herself to be photographed, a pale but composed figure on her father's balcony, wrapped in a cashmere shawl. She gave one interview to a carefully selected journalist, speaking in soft generalities about trauma, gratitude, and the preciousness of life. The public wept and applauded. Brett Van Allen looked at his daughter with a heart full of a painful, hopeful love. He saw fragility carefully braced. He did not see the calculation. She asked for things. Small things at first. To understand the family's charitable foundations. To sit in on a board meeting for one of the quieter trusts. Her father was eager to indulge her, to give her purpose, to anchor her in the safe, sanitized world of philanthropy. She learned quickly. Money was a current, and directing it was a matter of channels and dams. She began to suggest subtle redirections. A donation to a bail fund here. A grant to a community center in a neighborhood known for its gang activity there. Not enough to raise eyebrows, just enough to test the levers. Crow watched. He read the society pages. He saw her at a gallery opening, a ghost in a gown, and their eyes met across a room of chattering people. He gave a slow, almost invisible nod, an acknowledgement, a reminder. She returned a small, polite smile that held no warmth and no fear. The connection was a live wire, buried deep. Her father, emboldened by her apparent recovery, began to speak of the future, of her taking a larger role, of legacy. One evening over dinner in his sterile, modern penthouse, he pushed a folder toward her. "The security review," he said, his voice tight. "After what happened, we've overhauled everything. The best firm in the world. A complete audit of our personal protection, home systems, everything." Brooklyn opened the folder. She saw flowcharts, protocols, dossiers on new head of security candidates. It was a fortress blueprint. She traced a line on the page with her finger. "It's impressive," she said, "but it's all reactive. It's about keeping things out." She looked up at him. "What about understanding what's already in?" Brett frowned. "What do you mean?" "The world you operate in," she said, her voice gentle, exploratory. "You move markets, but there are other markets. The ones in shadows, the ones those men came from, to truly be safe. Don't we need to understand that too? Not to participate, but to see the shape of it." Her father stared, a fork poised in midair. He saw his little girl, and for a terrifying second, he saw something else looking out from behind her eyes. A general, assessing a map? He shook his head, dismissing the chill. "That's what I pay security experts and lawyers for, Brooke, to handle the darkness. Your job is to stay in the light." She nodded, acquiescing. "Of course, but the idea was planted. She didn't go to the security experts. She used the access her new charitable work gave her. She met with outreach coordinators in tough neighborhoods, with former inmates running rehab programs, with cops who walked the beat and knew the street names. She listened. She remembered names, hierarchies, tensions. She stored it away, not with the frantic fear of someone building a moat, but with the calm focus of someone drawing a map. Months passed. The Miracle Girl narrative began to fade, replaced by a new one. The philanthropist heiress. It was perfect camouflage. Then, a package arrived at her private office. No return address. Inside was a single, grainy photograph. It showed a man back to the camera getting into a car. The car's license plate was clear. It was a car registered to a shell company she recognized from her father's own security audit. A company used for discreet, off-the-books operations. The man in the photo was Crow. Attached was a note, typed on a cheap machine. He's asking different questions now. About money trails. About you. It was not a threat. It was a report. She had, without even fully intending to, begun to cultivate her own network. The hair tie was still in her drawer, clean and plain. A token, a line back to a world that understood transactions. She burned the photograph and note in her marble fireplace. She watched the flames consume the image of Crow, the man who held her secret. He was no longer just a witness. He was becoming an investigator, and his line of inquiry was a danger. That night, she didn't stare at the city from her penthouse. She opened her laptop, and using protocols she'd painstakingly learned from a wary, well-paid hacker she'd met through one of her community grants, she accessed a secure, anonymous channel. She typed a single line, a test, the first real step across a new and irrevocable line. "The detective needs a new case," she wrote. "Something far away. Something consuming." The reply took only minutes. "Budget?" She named a figure. It was not from her charity funds. It was from a private account, one her father didn't know existed, seeded with the proceeds from the discreet sale of a diamond necklace she'd never liked. "Consider it done," the reply came. Brooklyn closed the laptop. The silence in her luxurious apartment was complete. She felt no thrill, no dread. She felt the same cold, clear capacity she had felt on the warehouse floor, the gun heavy in her hand. They had tried to make her a prize, a victim, a symbol. They had succeeded only in making her a force. The world was a web of lines, of law, of morality, of society. And she had learned, in that concrete room, that lines were not walls. They were simply the places where you decided what you were. She got up, walked to the window, and looked out at the map of lights, already plotting her next quiet move. The transfer of Detective Crow was efficient and unremarkable. A high-profile, complex cartel investigation opened up on the opposite coast, requiring his specific expertise. The order came from high up, with a logic no one could fault. Brett Van Allen mentioned it over breakfast, reading the news on his tablet. "That detective from your case, Crow, got a big promotion, it seems. Shipped out to California." He said it lightly, a piece of trivia, a closed chapter. Brooklyn sipped her green juice. "That's good for him," she said, her voice a soft, neutral thing. With Crow's probing presence removed, the space around her seemed to expand, the air less charged. She deepened her work. The charitable foundation became a legitimate front, a hive of positive activity, but its roots began to spread into darker soil. The community center grant led to an introduction to a man named Miro, who ran a boxing gym, and it was quietly understood, brokered peace between rival crews. He was in his 50s, with a flattened nose and eyes that held a weary kind of wisdom. He didn't treat her like a victim or a princess. He treated her like a potential business partner, which she appreciated. They met in his office, a cramped room smelling of sweat and liniment. "You keep sending money to the right places," he said, not looking at her, cleaning a pair of boxing gloves with a towel. "But money's a flashlight. It shows you things, but it also shows everyone where you're standing." "What do you suggest?" she asked. "Information," Miro said, finally meeting her gaze. "You want to understand the shape of the shadows. You need ears, not paid snitches, people who owe you. You create quiet favors. You become a solution, not just a bank account." She took his advice. She didn't just fund legal aid. She connected a talented disbarred lawyer she'd discreetly subsidized to a family in Miro's network. She didn't just donate to a clinic. She ensured the daughter of a certain mid-level figure in a distribution chain got a specific expensive surgery not covered by any insurance. Each action was deniable, layered through multiple cutouts. But the gratitude flowed back to her, a silent current of obligation. She was building a latticework, not of power, but of influence. It was a different kind of architecture than her father's, all visible steel and glass. Hers was built in the cavities between walls. A year to the day after the warehouse, She woke not from the old nightmare of the mattress and the iron, but from a new dream. In it, she was walking across the vast, polished foyer of her father's home. The line in the marble was not a boundary, but a path, and she was walking it with perfect balance, arms outstretched. On either side of her, in the shadows of the colonnade, stood figures. Kingston, Dennis, Leo, Dido, her father, Crodo, Miro. They were all watching, none of them speaking, their faces impossible to read. She was the only thing in the light. She got out of bed, the dream's clarity clinging to her. She went to her dressing room, and from the back of a drawer she pulled out the hair tie. It was just a scrap of elastic now, stretched from use. She put it on her wrist, a dark band against her skin. That afternoon, a message arrived through her secure channel. It was a single sentence regarding a looming territorial dispute that threatened to spill violence into one of her funded community zones. The situation requires mediation, an outside voice, a respected voice. She knew what it was. A test, not of her money, but of her authority, of the myth that was quietly growing around her. The girl who had faced the darkness and not blinked, who moved now in both worlds and belonged to neither. She typed her reply. Set the meeting, neutral ground. The chosen location was a closed fish market, all damp concrete, and the ghost smell of salt. Brooklyn arrived alone, having given her security detail an elaborate misdirection. Miro was there, a silent, hulking presence by a stack of crates. Two men faced each other across a concrete table, their young and angry faces illuminated by a single hanging work light. They were lieutenants, each believing they had been disrespected, each ready to start a war over a few city blocks. They looked at her as she approached, confusion turning to a flicker of recognition, then to a wary, superstitious awe. She was a story to them, ghost from the warehouse. She didn't sit. She placed her hands on the cold concrete table, the hair tie visible on her wrist. You both lose if this fight happens, she said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast empty space. It held no emotion. It was simply a fact, delivered like the weather. The police are looking for a reason to sweep through. Your operations will be disrupted. Your profits will vanish. You will be dead or in cages, and your enemies will take everything. She looked from one to the other. I have a proposal. She outlined it not as a compromise, but as a new, more profitable arrangement for both, using channels and opportunities her legitimate ventures could provide. It was a business deal, cold and clean. She spoke their language, the language of risk and yield. The anger in their eyes didn't fade, but it was joined by calculation. By the end, they had agreed, not out of friendship, but out of a chilled respect for the sense of what she said, and the unsettling, powerful myth of who she was. As they left, Miro let out a long, slow breath. You know you can't just be the mediator forever, right? You step into the middle. You become the ground they fight over if you ever slip. Brooklyn watched the retreating figures disappear into the mist outside the market. I know, she said. She turned her wrist, looking at the dark band against her skin. It was no longer a reminder of what had been taken from her. It was a reminder of what she had taken. She had crossed a line, and then she had erased it, and now she was drawing her own. The world was not light and dark. It was a spectrum, and she was learning to see and use every shade. The drive back to her apartment was quiet, the city lights streaking the car windows. She felt the weight of the fish market settling into her bones, not as fear, but as a new kind of gravity. She had acted, and the world had shifted. A small shift, but a real one. Her father was waiting for her in her living room, his face pale with a controlled anger. Your detail lost you for 3 hours, he said. His voice clipped. Care to explain? Brooklyn set her purse down calmly. I needed to be alone, to think. It was the anniversary, Dad. The mention of the anniversary deflated him, as she knew it would. His anger melted into concern. You can't do that, Brooke. It's not safe. The world isn't safe for you. The world isn't safe for anyone, she replied, moving to pour herself a glass of water. But I'm not a child in a tower anymore. I need to breathe sometimes, without an entourage. He studied her, the familiar frustration and fear warring in his eyes. He saw the cashmere shawl, the elegant lines of her dress, the calm posture. He did not see the smell of the fish market on her shoes, or the quiet echo of a young lieutenant's voice saying, "We'll do it your way." He saw only what he needed to see, his daughter healing, but fragile. "I'm expanding the security," he said finally. A decision made. Around the clock in the building lobby, a driver you don't dismiss. It's non-negotiable. She nodded, a picture of resigned acceptance. "I understand." After he left, she stood on her balcony, the cold wind cutting through her thin dress. The new security was a complication, but not an insurmountable one. Every fortress had its blind spots, and she was learning to be a blind spot. She thought of Crow, 3,000 miles away, chasing cartel money, Dr. Gio. He was a good detective. He would find his new case consuming, but eventually he would solve it. And then his mind, that persistent, factual mind, might wander back to a warehouse, to a blood-stained hair tie, to an heiress whose eyes held no ghosts, only a terrible clarity. She needed a more permanent solution than distraction. She needed him to be compromised. The next day, through Miro, she sent a message. It was a question, not a command. Does the detective have a pressure point? Something clean, something personal. The answer came back a week later. Crow had a brother, a younger brother named Paul, who owned a struggling organic farm upstate. Paul Crow was in debt to a local credit union, loans called due. The farm was his life. The detective sent money when he could, but it was never enough. It was perfect. It was clean. It was personal. Brooklyn arranged for the Van Allen Family Foundation to establish a new sustainable agriculture grant. The criteria were specific. The selection committee hands-off. Paul Crow's application, submitted with desperate hope, sailed through. The grant was substantial enough to pay off the debts and secure the farm's future. It was all perfectly legal, impeccably documented, a feel-good story of philanthropy. She had a copy of the award letter sent to Detective Crow's attention, with a note from the foundation director expressing admiration for his public service and hope that this would ease his family's burdens. It was a masterstroke. If Crow ever looked too closely at her again, he would now be looking at the hand that had saved his brother's dream. His facts would be tangled with gratitude, his pursuit poisoned by obligation. She received a brief formal email from Crow himself a few days later. "Thank you for the Foundation's generosity to my brother. It will make a profound difference." The subtext was as clear to her as a shout. "I see what this is." Message received. The line between them was no longer just a shared secret. It was now a debt. And she held the paper. That evening, she attended a symphony gala with her father. She wore emerald green and smiled for the cameras. During the intermission, as she sipped champagne, an elderly society matron clasped her hand. "You are a light in this city, my dear," the woman said, her eyes moist. "After all you suffered, to give so much back, you are an inspiration." Brooklyn squeezed the woman's hand gently. "Thank you. We all have to find our purpose, don't we?" she said, her voice warm and sincere. Over the woman's shoulder, she caught her father's gaze. He was beaming with pride, his arm around the mayor, no doubt talking about the new foundation initiatives. He saw a legacy of light being built. He saw his daughter saved. Brooklyn smiled back at him, then let her eyes drift over the glittering crowd. The jewels, the tailored suits. She saw the lines of power and influence, the visible threads, and beneath them, she felt the humming of the other web, the one she was weaving in the quiet. She was not an inspiration. She was a system, and she was just beginning to learn how to run. Story 2. The silence was the first thing he noticed. Not the absence of sound, for the city below his balcony hummed with its usual nocturnal fever, a symphony of distant engines and muffled lives. It was the silence within the walls of his own apartment, a hollowed-out quality in the air, as if the very molecules had stopped vibrating in anticipation of a note that would never come. For 3 years, the soft, rhythmic scratch of a charcoal pencil on heavy paper had been the heartbeat of this place. His wife, Ilara, would draw late into the night. Her concentration of physical presence, a warmth. That sound was gone. The silence it left behind wasn't empty. It was an entity, cold and interrogative. Amos stood at the balcony door, a tumbler of melting ice in his hand, the whiskey untouched. He was a man built for silence, trained in its nuances, but this was a different breed. This silence had a shape. It was the shape of the empty drafting table in the corner, the sheet of paper pinned there, blank. It was the shape of the single, unfinished sketch she'd left behind. His own sleeping face, rendered with such tender precision it felt like a violation to look at it. The mission had come that morning. A call from Deacon that was all business. A metallic voice offering a return to the fold. "We have a thread on the tailor," Deacon had said, using the operational name as if Amos hadn't been dreaming of it for 18 months. "Your thread, it's time to sew it up." And just like that, the delicate life he'd been painstakingly assembling, the one meant to replace the one he'd shattered, was rendered again into a blank page. Darren, known in whispers as the tailor, didn't leave corpses. He left compositions. A financier in Geneva found in his vault, posed as if in prayer, a single, priceless orchid resting on his chest. An environmental minister in Oslo, drowned in her own filtered rainwater tank, her skin meticulously scrubbed of pollutants. His kills were messages, elegant and cruel, stitched into the fabric of the world with a needle's precision. He was a legend, a ghost with a portfolio, and 18 months ago, in a fog of grief and pills and bourbon, Amos had let him slip through his fingers in Marrakech. Ilara had left 2 weeks later. The silence had moved in shortly after. Now, the hunt led to Port of Spain, Trinidad, a city that breathed in humid floral gasps. The air was a wet wool blanket scented with frangipani diesel and the tang of the sea. Amos moved through it like a stain, his internal desolation mirrored by the vibrant, overwhelming life around him. His local ally was a man named Simeon, whose eyes were the color of old rum and held no trust. They met in a rum shop where the ceiling fan chopped the thick air into stale, sluggish pieces. "He's here," Simeon said, not looking at Amos, watching the street where children kicked a deflated ball. "But he is not a man. He's a weather pattern. You feel the pressure drop. You see the leaves turn silver. But by the time the wind comes, you are already gone." The tailor's accomplices were extensions of his will, not thugs. Amos spotted one at the Queen's Park Savannah, a tall, severe man in an immaculate linen suit, feeding pigeons. The man didn't watch Amos. He watched the patterns the birds made as they scattered and coalesced, as if reading portents in their flight. Another was a silent driver for a diplomat's wife, his eyes in the rearview mirror holding the flat calm of deep, still water. They were reflections of their master, each a polished surface showing a different facet of a single dark jewel. And then there was Cindy. She appeared at a gallery opening, a fundraiser for the local symphony. She was a curator, or perhaps a patron, her beauty not striking but unfolding, like the slow opening of a night-blooming cereus. She wore a dress, the color of a bruise, and her laughter was a low, melodic sound that seemed to momentarily dispel the humidity. Amos saw the tailor's mark on her before he saw the man himself. It was in the careful way she held herself, a slight tension in the neck, as if she were a precious object on display under a museum light. She was a piece in the composition, though whether as ornament or target, Amos couldn't yet tell. He followed her to a house perched in the lush green hills overlooking the city. It was a modern structure of glass and concrete, a cool geometric eye staring out at the chaotic, teeming landscape. From his vantage in the dripping jungle, Amos watched through binoculars. He saw Darren for the first time in 18 months. The man moved through the spacious living room, pouring 2 glasses of wine. He moved with an economical grace, no motion wasted, a man completely at home in the space he occupied. He handed a glass to Cindy, his fingers not touching hers. He did not smile. He was, Amos thought, a man who had removed everything from his life that did not serve his function. He was a finished sentence. Amos' own reflection, caught in the lens of his binoculars, was a smear of shadow and stubble, a question mark written in flesh and fatigue. He was not a finished anything. He was a collection of broken parts, a husband who failed at marriage, an agent who failed his mission, a man haunted by a specific silence. The hunt was no longer about redemption for the service. It was about erasing the reflection of the tailor's perfection that he saw in every mirrored surface, a perfection that highlighted his own cracks. The confrontation, when it came, was not in a crowded bazaar or on a rain-slicked pier. It was in the echoing, tiled space of the Port of Spain wholesale fish market, long after midnight. The stench was biblical. A cold, salty reek of scale and gut, of ice melting into blood-tinged water. The only light came from sporadic, buzzing, fluorescent tubes that made the shadows leap and pool like spilled oil. Darren emerged from behind a hanging curtain of giant tuna, their eyes clouded like moonstones. He wore a dark, thin sweater and trousers, his hands empty. He looked like a professor who had taken a wrong turn. "Amos," Darren said, his voice calm, carrying easily in the damp hollow. "I've been expecting you." The man with the silent house. The words were a needle slipped between Amos' ribs. How could he know? The question must have shown on his face. "The unfinished sketch on the board," Darren continued, moving slowly along a stainless steel table. A man repose, but the lines around the eyes, they were lines of a man listening to a silence so loud it drowns out the world. Only a man who has lost his anchor sound would hunt with such desperate focus. You're not here for your country. You're here to find a noise loud enough to fill that quiet. Amos said nothing. He raised his pistol, the motion feeling crude, theatrical. Darren smiled, a thin curve of the lips. "You think this is about a duel, a test of skill. It is about philosophy. I impose order, a final, beautiful order on the chaos of a life. You are chaos trying to impersonate order. The service, the mission, the wife, they are costumes you put on. Underneath, you are as formless as that silence you carry." He took a step closer. "She left because you are a locked door, Amos, and you threw away the key yourself in Morocco. I didn't take anything from you that you weren't already desperate to lose." The truth of it, weaponized and delivered with that serene precision, was more paralyzing than a bullet. The gun in Amos' hand felt like a piece of lead. He saw not an assassin before him, but a mirror that showed him a man defined by absence, hunting a ghost to avoid facing the hollow man in the glass. From the shadows, one of the accomplices appeared, a sleek pistol aimed at Amos' heart. Darren held up a single finger. The man froze. "No," Darren said, his eyes never leaving Amos. "This is not how it ends for him. A bullet is an ending. It is a period. He deserves a semicolon." He looked at Amos with something akin to pity. "Go home. Sit in your silence. Listen to it. It is the only honest thing you have left." He turned and walked away, his footsteps silent on the wet tiles. The accomplice melted back into the darkness, leaving Amos alone in the cathedral of stench and dying light, the gun trembling now in his hand, pointed at nothing. Deacon's voice on the satellite phone, hours later, was a crackle of static and fury. "He was there, and you engaged? Report, Amos. Did you secure the asset?" Amos stood on the balcony of his safe house, looking at the waking city. The morning sun was burning off the mist, revealing the tangled, vibrant, messy life below. He thought of Cindy, another soul momentarily caught in the Taylor's orbit, and knew she would be unharmed. She was not the target. She had been the setting, the vase for the orchid. He had been the target all along. "No," Amos said, his voice quiet, final. "The asset was never there." There was a long pause. "What does that mean?" "Amos, your status is hanging by a thread." "Then cut it," Amos said. He placed the phone, still sputtering with Deacon's disembodied demands, on the balcony railing. He walked back inside, through the sterile, temporary room. He did not pack. He took only the wallet holding his civilian identification, the one he hadn't used in years. He descended the stairs and emerged onto the street, where the city was now loud with traffic and music and the shouts of vendors. He began to walk. He walked past the rum shop where Simeon would be waiting for a report that would never come. He walked through the crowds, his shoulders brushing against lives full of their own mundane noise and struggle and love. He walked away from the mission, from the service, from the ghost of the tailor and the perfect, terrifying order he represented. He walked away from the hollow man who hunted ghosts. He did not look back. He moved east, toward the docks, toward the endless, formless sea, leaving the case and all its piercing, unanswered questions behind him. The silence inside him was still there, but it was no longer a hollow thing. It was a space, vast and quiet, and for the first time, he considered the possibility that it might not be something to fill, but something to inhabit. He was a sentence without a period, a door left swinging on its hinges, and he walked into the humid, breathing morning, a man finally beginning, not ending, his story. The docks were a world of clatter and shouts, of ropes slapping against masts, and the groan of tired hulls. The air here smelled of tar and fish and diesel, a welcome assault after the perfumed decay of the fish market. Amos moved through the chaos without a destination, a single still point in the turning world. He bought a coffee from a cart, the bitter liquid scalding his tongue, a sensation so raw and present, it felt like an anchor. A freighter was loading the Santa Maria, bound for Recife, then Lisbon. He watched the crew, men with faces carved by wind and salt, shouting in a mix of Portuguese and English. He felt the weight of the wallet in his pocket, the thin plastic of his civilian ID, John Amos Miller. Born in Portland, Maine, a fisherman's son, an identity he had shed like a skin a lifetime ago. It felt flimsy, a fiction, but no more so than the one he had just abandoned. He approached the foreman, a grizzled man with a clipboard. "You need an extra hand?" Amos asked, his voice rough from disuse. The foreman looked him up and down, seeing the tension in his shoulders, the shadows under his eyes. "You know a hawser from a halyard?" "I can learn," Amos said. It was the truest thing he had said in years. A shrug. "Talk to the mate. He's on the bridge. We sail with the tide." 2 hours later, Amos stood at the stern rail as the Santa Maria chugged out of the Gulf of Paria, the green mountains of Trinidad dissolving into a haze. The thrum of the engines vibrated up through the deck plates into his bones. It was a deep, mechanical drone, a sound without subtlety or mercy. He let it fill him, a physical noise to crowd out the metaphysical silence. He shared a cramped cabin with 3 other men. Their talk was of home, of money, of women in ports they missed. They asked him no questions. He was just another broken bird seeking passage over the water. At night, lying in his bunk, he did not dream of Darren or Ilara or the blank page on the drafting table. He dreamed of the sea, a vast, dark, formless chaos that somehow held a rhythm in its depths. Weeks passed, measured in watches kept and decks swapped. The work was hard, mindless, purifying. His hands grew raw, then calloused. The salt air and the sun began to soften the hard lines of his face. He ate in the mess. He laughed at crude jokes. He learned the knots. He was not happy, but he was present. The silence within him began to change its texture. It was no longer an interrogator. It became a companion, a wide, quiet sea of its own. In Lisbon, he jumped ship. He used his last pay to buy a train ticket north, to Porto. He rented a small room, overlooking the Douro River. He bought a notebook, a cheap one with blank-lined pages. He did not draw. He began to write. Not a report, not a confession, just words. Descriptions of the light on the water, the taste of the coffee, the sound of the trams. He wrote about the silence, giving it shape with sentences, containing it on the page. One rainy afternoon, sitting in a cafe, he wrote a single line. I am not a locked door. I am a room, and the windows are open. He looked up from the page. Outside, the city gleamed under the gentle rain, beautiful and imperfect. He thought of Cindy, probably already forgetting the strange, intense man at the gallery. He thought of Darren, somewhere, composing his next dark poem. He thought of Ilara, her pencil scratching a new life onto a new sheet of paper somewhere far away. He felt no pull toward any of them. They were chapters in a book he had closed. He paid for his coffee and stepped out into the rain. He did not open his umbrella. He let the water soak his hair, run down his neck. It was a feeling, a simple, undeniable fact of being alive. He walked without a map, turning where the street seemed interesting, a sentence meandering across the page of the city, no longer in need of a period, content. For now, with the possibility of a comma. With the possibility of a comma. The hunt was over. The manhunt, and the hunt for the man he was supposed to be. What remained was just a man, walking in the rain, listening to the sound of his own footsteps, and finding, to his quiet astonishment, that they were enough. The rain in Porto had a different music than the tropical downpours of Trinidad. It was a soft, persistent patter on cobblestones, a whisper against roof tiles, a hush that seemed to deepen the city's ancient calm. Amos walked until his clothes were heavy with water, until the chill seeped into his bones and felt, paradoxically, like a warmth. It was the feeling of being real, of occupying a physical space in a physical world. He found himself before a small church, its stone facade darkened by the wet. On an impulse, he pushed the heavy door and went inside. The air was still and smelled of old wood, wax, and damp wool. A few old women knelt in the pews, their heads bowed. He sat in the back, not to pray, but to simply be in the quiet. This quiet was different too. It was a gathered quiet, a held breath, not the hollow silence of his old apartment. This quiet had history and purpose. He let it settle over him. When he emerged, the rain had lightened to a mist. A bookshop across the street glowed with a yellow light. He crossed, the bell above the door tinkling as he entered. It was a cramped, wonderful place, shelves towering to the ceiling, filled with volumes in Portuguese, French, English. He browsed without intent, his fingers trailing over leather and cloth spines. In a corner, he found a section on art, not the glossy monographs, but technical books on perspective, on anatomy, on the chemistry of pigments. He picked up a heavy volume on figure drawing. He flipped through the pages, past diagrams of musculature and bone structure, and stopped at a page of hands. Studies of hands in every position, clasped, open, holding, letting go. He thought of Ilara's hands, the charcoal smudges on her knuckles, the precise pressure of her fingers on the pencil. The memory came without the usual stab of pain. It was just a memory, a fact of his history, like the scar on his ribs from a long-ago fight. He bought the book. He also bought a small set of pencils and a pad of decent paper. He didn't know if he would use them. The act of purchase was not a promise, but a permission. Back in his room, he placed the book and the pencils on the small table by the window. He made tea. He sat and watched the river, the lights of Villanova de Gaia beginning to glitter on the far bank as evening fell. The silence in the room was full now. It was filled with the memory of the church, the echo of the bookshop bell, the soft hiss of the kettle, the distant sound of a guitar from a cafe down the lane. He opened the notebook where he had been writing. He read his own words from the past weeks. They were simple, observational, the notes of a man learning to see again. He turned to a fresh page. He picked up a pencil. He did not try to draw his own face, or Ilara's, or the tailor's composed features. He looked at his own left hand, resting on the table. He began to draw its outline, the blunt fingers, the old scars across the knuckles. His lines were hesitant, clumsy. The proportions were off. It looked like a child's drawing. He smiled. He did not erase. He kept drawing, adding shade, trying to capture the way the lamplight fell across the ridges of his tendons. It was terrible. It was alive. The scratch of the graphite on the paper was a tiny, fragile sound in the quiet room. It was not the heartbeat he had lost. It was a new sound, a different rhythm, tentative and alone. He listened to it, his whole being focused on the imperfect line emerging from the tip of his pencil. And for the first time in 3 years, the silence within him did not feel like an absence waiting to be filled. It felt like a page, waiting for a mark. He worked until his hand cramped and the light failed. The drawing was a mess, but it was his mess. He slept a deep, dreamless sleep. And in the morning, he went out and bought a better lamp. The days began to structure themselves around this new, self-appointed task. Mornings were for writing in the notebook, afternoons for walking the city, evenings for drawing. He drew his coffee cup. He drew the twisted limbs of the olive tree in the square. He drew the old fisherman who mended nets by the river, capturing not a likeness but the curve of his concentration. He filled pages with failures, and slowly the failures became less grotesque. They became studies. He learned to see light as a thing that had volume, and shadow as a substance. He thought of Darren less and less. The tailor's philosophy of imposed final order now seemed like the ultimate childishness, a tantrum against the beautiful, redeemable mess of existence. Amos was learning to make peace with the mess, starting with the one on his own page. One Thursday, the market was full of flowers. He bought a single white orchid, its structure impossibly complex and delicate. He spent 3 days drawing it, trying to understand the logic of its form. On the third day, as he shaded the subtle lip of the blossom, he realized he was no longer drawing the orchid itself, but the space it held in the world, the way the air seemed to bend around its perfection. He was drawing its relationship to everything else. It was the first truly intelligent line he had ever made. He put the pencil down. He looked at the drawing, then at the living flower on the table. A profound, quiet exhilaration filled him. It was not joy, not exactly. It was the satisfaction of a problem understood, a language beginning to be deciphered. He had spent his life looking for patterns in chaos to control or destroy them. Now he was learning to see the pattern that was simply there, the order that existed without the need for imposition. That night, he wrote a letter. It was not to Ilara. It was to Deacon. It was short. It contained no apologies, no explanations, no intelligence. It simply read, "I am out. Do not look. I am not lost." He signed it with his old operational code, a ghost signing its own discharge papers. He mailed it from a box in a different neighborhood, a final, tidy severance. The seasons turned. The tourist crowds came and went. Amos's Portuguese became functional. He found a smaller, quieter room in a building full of students and artists, the sound of their arguments and music a pleasant murmur through the walls. He took a job 2 days a week at the bookshop, sorting inventory. It paid for his room and his paper. One spring morning, a woman came into the shop. She was looking for a guide to the architecture of the Ribera district. Her hair was the color of polished cherry wood, and she had a smudge of blue paint on her wrist. They spoke briefly about the merits of different books. Her name was Sophia. She was a ceramicist, she said, forever trying to capture the color of the Porto sky in glaze. Her eyes were the same color as that sky after rain. He did not feel a spark. He felt a recognition. Here was another person engaged in the lifelong, humble struggle to translate the world into form. When she left, she did not give him her number, and he did not ask for it. But the next week, she returned, asking if a shipment of art history texts had arrived. It had not. They talked for 20 minutes about the impossibility of capturing light in clay. The third time she visited, he was off duty, sitting at a cafe table on the plaza outside the shop, attempting to draw the tram lines as they converged. She saw his drawing. She did not praise it. She pointed to a line and said, "The perspective is off here. See? The vanishing point is confused." He looked, and she was right. He laughed, a real unguarded sound that surprised him. She smiled, and the smudge of paint on her wrist was a different blue that day. He did not tell her about his past. He told her about the orchid and about the fisherman's nets. She told him about the alchemy of kilns, how the fire transformed the fragile clay into something that could endure. They spoke of craft, not of confession. It was a conversation built not on the rubble of previous lives, but on the shared ground of the present moment. Amos continued to walk, to write, to draw. The silence was still there, but it was no longer a room he inhabited alone. It was the space between notes and music, the ground that made the figure visible. It was the quiet from which all honest marks begin. He was no longer a sentence seeking punctuation. He was a story, slowly, patiently, being written by his own hand, one imperfect, necessary line at a time. The hunt was over. The making had begun. The blue on Sophia's wrist changed with the weeks. Cobalt, then slate, then a pale, milky azure. Amos began to note the colors in the margin of his sketchbook, a silent catalog of her progress in the elusive pursuit of that Porto sky. Their conversations remained rooted in the tangible, the grain of paper, the grit of clay, the way the afternoon light slanted through the bookshop window. It was a language without subtext, and in its simplicity, Amos found a profound relief. He showed her his drawings. She showed him her test tiles, small squares of ceramic each glazed with subtle variations. One, a mottled gray-blue, made his breath catch. "That's it," he said. "That's the color of the river today, just before the rain." She looked from the tile to his face, her gaze thoughtful. "You see it too," she said, and it was not a question. It was an acknowledgement of a shared faculty, a way of perceiving that needed no further explanation. One evening, she invited him to her studio, a cluttered space overlooking a narrow alley, smelling of damp clay and minerals. Works in progress sat on shelves, bowls that echoed the curves of hillsides, vases that seemed to hold not space, but silence. She was at the wheel, her hands coaxing a form from a spinning lump of clay. He watched, mesmerized by the sure, gentle pressure of her fingers, the way the form rose and widened as if breathing. "It looks like peace," he said, the words out before he could consider them. Her hands stilled. The wheel slowed. "It's a funeral urn," she said softly. Commission. For a woman's husband." Amos felt no awkwardness, only a deepening of the quiet in the room. "Then it is peace," he said. She nodded, and her hands began to move again, refining the shape. He picked up a sketchbook from a stool, hers, and flipped through pages of form studies, anatomical sketches of birds, rapid watercolors of cloud formations. Her line was confident, lyrical where his was deliberate. In the back, he found a single, unfinished portrait of a man with a kind, tired face. He closed the book gently. He did not ask. She did not offer. The silence that followed was companionable, filled with the soft sound of the wheel and the distant echo of footsteps in the alley. He sat on a stool by the window and took out his own sketchbook. He did not draw her. He drew the urn on the wheel, the elegant curve of its shoulder, the way it seemed both heavy and weightless. He drew the space it held. When he finished, he tore the page out and placed it on a clean shelf beside her tiles. She glanced at it, a smile touching the corners of her eyes. "You are learning," she said. It was the finest compliment he had ever received. Weeks blended into a month, then 2. The letter to Deacon had worked, or perhaps the service had simply written him off as a lost cause. No ghosts tapped him on the shoulder. The only past that visited him now was his own, and it came not as a pursuer but as a faint, fading echo. He dreamed of the sea sometimes, but now he was on the surface, buoyant, the sun on his face. One afternoon, Sophia found him at the river's edge, sketching the iron bridge. "I'm firing the kiln tonight," she said. "The big urn. It's a long process. The kiln must cool slowly, or it cracks. I stay and watch the temperature. Would you like to keep watch with me?" He met her eyes. This was not an invitation to her studio, but to a vigil, a shared, quiet watch through the night. He nodded. They sat on stools in the dim studio as the kiln's elements glowed a faint, hellish orange behind its insulated door. She explained the process, the stages of the firing, the transformation of the soft clay into ceramic stone. He listened, the technical details a liturgy in the warm dark. As the night deepened, their talk drifted. She spoke of growing up in a village in the north, of the cold, clear light there. He found himself speaking, not of missions or loss, but of the fog off the coast of Maine, the way it could swallow the world and leave only the sound of a bellboy. "That is a good sound to be left with," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." In the small hours, when the kiln was cooling and the studio was lit only by a single lamp, she reached over and took his hand. Her fingers were dry and warm, marked with the permanent fine lines of clay dust. He looked at their joined hands, then at her face. There was no urgency in her expression, only a calm, open waiting. He felt no leap of the heart, no dizzying rush. Instead, he felt a settling, as if a part of him he hadn't known was tense had finally relaxed. He laced his fingers with hers. The silence in the room was the rich, complete silence of a thing understood, not the hollow silence of a thing missing. When the first gray light of dawn touched the window, they were still there, hands clasped, watching over the kiln that held its transformation. The urn inside was either perfect or it was flawed. They would not know until it was cool. That uncertainty, Amos realized, was not a threat. It was the condition of all making, of all living. It was the space where hope, not fear, could quietly grow. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. Outside, The city began to wake, and the new light was the color of a sky after rain. A color they both knew, a color they were both, in their own ways, learning to hold. The walk back to his room as the city woke felt different. The cobblestones, the washing hung between buildings, the early smell of bread. It was all the same, yet it seemed to hold a new clarity, as if he were seeing it through Sophia's eyes as well as his own. He did not go to sleep. He made tea and sat by his window, the drawing of the urn on the table beside him. He looked at his own hands, resting on his knees. They were the hands of a man who had held a gun, a pen, a stranger's shoulder in a crowd, and now another artist's hand through the night. They were capable of many things. The choice of what to hold and how to hold it was his. He opened his notebook. For a long time, he wrote nothing. Then, he began to write, not about what he saw, but about what he felt. The words were clumsy, unfamiliar on the page. He wrote about the warmth of the kiln on his face, the dry texture of clay dust on skin, the specific weight of a shared silence. It was not a report. It was an attempt to translate a feeling into a form he could keep. He understood then that this was what Sophia did with her glazes, what he was fumbling toward with his pencil. It was all translation. The world into feeling, feeling into form, a continuous, imperfect conversation with existence. Later that week, the urn was unveiled. It was perfect. The glaze, that river gray blue, had fired to a deep, luminous satin, capturing light and softness in a vessel meant for ashes. Sophia did not celebrate. She simply nodded, ran a finger along its rim, and packed it carefully in a box lined with wool. The commission completed, she cleaned her studio with a kind of ritual thoroughness. Amos helped, sweeping clay scraps from the floor. In the clean, empty space, he looked at him and said, "I need to go to my village for a few days. The light there, it resets me. Would you come?" He had not left Porto since arriving. The thought of another place, another set of rhythms, was a sudden, wide horizon. "Yes," he said. The village was 3 hours north, a cluster of granite houses clinging to a hillside above a fierce, cold river. The light was indeed different, sharp, clear, and thin, washing everything in a pale, honest wash. Sophia's family home was small and sturdy, smelling of wood smoke and dried herbs. Her mother, a woman with Sophia's eyes and a face mapped by wind, asked no probing questions. She fed them soup and dark bread, and in the evening she showed Amos her own craft, intricate lace made on a pillow with swift clicking bobbins. Another translation, he thought. Patience into pattern, not gibber. He walked the high meadows alone, the air so quiet he could hear the buzz of insects, and the distant rush of the river as separate, distinct threads of sound. He tried to draw the landscape, but his lines failed to capture the vast, empty grandeur of it. He put the sketchbook away and simply sat on a rock, feeling the sun and the wind, a small creature in a large, ancient world. He was not hiding here. He was just being. The distinction was everything. On their last evening, Sophia took him to a place where the river had carved a deep, smooth basin in the rock. "Swim," she said, already pulling off her sweater. The water was glacial, a shock that stole his breath. They swam in the piercing cold, gasping and laughing, their skin turning pink, and when they climbed out and sat shivering on a sun-warmed stone, she leaned against him. He put his arm around her, feeling the rapid beat of her heart through her chilled skin, feeling his own heart beating back just as fast. It was not passion, but aliveness, shared and amplified by the cold, clean water and the towering sky. Back in Porto, a letter was waiting for him at the bookshop. It bore no return address, but the handwriting was a familiar, precise block. Deacon's. His stomach tightened, an old instinctive coil. He took it to the riverbank to open it. The letter was brief. Code received. Consider yourself discharged. The file is closed. A word of advice from one old friend to another. A man who is not lost must still be careful where he plants his feet. The ground has a memory. Be well. Amos read it twice, then held the paper over the water. He let it go. The current took it, swirling it away until it became a white speck and then vanished. It was not a threat, he decided. It was a warning, and perhaps even a blessing. The ground did have a memory. He was learning to read it, not as a tracker reads a trail, but as a gardener understands soil. That night, in his room, he did not draw or write. He packed a small bag. The next morning, he went to Sophia's studio. She was wedging a new lump of clay, her arms strong and rhythmic. "I'm going to Lisbon for a week," he said. "Maybe 2. There is a museum there with a drawing by Leonardo. Just a study of a sleeve. I want to see it." She stopped, clay in hands, and looked at him. She understood. He was not leaving. He was going to look at a mark made by a master, to learn from it, to continue his own education. He was planting his feet on new ground, deliberately. "Will you come back?" she asked, her voice level. "Yes," he said. "I have a job here, and a friend." She nodded, a small, satisfied smile on her lips. "Bring me a postcard of the sleeve. I want to see the line." He did. He went to Lisbon, and he stood before the delicate, precise drawing for a long time, seeing the thought in every hatch mark. He walked a new city, his footsteps a new sentence. He sent Sophia a postcard, not of the sleeve, but of the Tagus River at dusk. On the back he wrote only, "The light here is different, but the principle is the same." When he returned to Porto, he went straight from the train station to her studio, his small bag in hand. The bell above the bookshop door tinkled the next morning when he returned to work. The students in his building played their music. The rain fell, and he walked in it, sometimes with an umbrella, sometimes without. The hunt was long over. The man he was supposed to be was a faded outline on an old, discarded page. The man he was here, in this room, in this city, with this woman, learning line by line the difficult and beautiful craft of being alive. Story 3. The air in the library was not right. It was a subtle thing. A detail felt more than seen. A pocket of cold that lingered near the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the manicured lawn. The rest of the room held the dry, even warmth of central heating. A climate of money that knew no seasons. But here, by the glass, the air bit at Kyle's ankles with a damp, insistent chill. It was the ghost of an opened window, a recent violation of the sealed perfection of the house. He stood very still, letting the cold climb his legs, and looked out at the night. The lawn was a black ocean, the distant hedges, its dark, frozen waves. Someone had been here. Someone had let the outside in. 3 months earlier, Kyle had known only the dry, relentless heat of a Phoenix warehouse district. His world was the smell of asphalt and diesel, the texture of cardboard boxes against his palms, the soundtrack of forklifts and tired men. He stacked and sorted, a ghost in his own life, watching the world of ease and beauty through the smudged window of his phone screen. It was there he found Jordan Van Alder, heir to the Van Alder pharmaceutical fortune, a sun-bleached prince of Ibiza and Gestad, whose life was a cascade of laughter, white sand, and effortless possession. Kyle didn't just follow him, he studied him. The angle of a smile, the careless drape of a linen shirt, the particular slang tossed to friends whose names Kyle learned by heart. It was an anthropology of privilege, and Kyle was its most devoted and most invisible scholar. The opportunity came not from a dream, but from a lawyer's office. Caleb Van Alder, Jordan's father, A man whose voice on the conference call was as dry and crisp as a new banknote had a problem. His son, enjoying a permanent, funded vacation at the family chateau in the south of France, had become unreachable. Bills mounted, rumors of reckless behavior swirled, and a crucial family gathering, a merger of fortunes and a wedding announcement, loomed. Caleb needed someone unassuming, reliable, and cheap to go over, assess the situation, and gently remind Jordan of his duties. He needed a messenger, a servant. He found Kyle, recommended by a subordinate for his quiet efficiency. The salary offered was a king's ransom to Kyle. The assignment was a passport to the very world he had worshipped from the desert. The chateau was not a building, but a living organism of stone and light and scent. It smelled of old roses, beeswax, and underneath it all, the faint, clean smell of money. Jordan was not what Kyle expected. The golden god from the screens was thinner, his eyes shadowed by more than just a late night. He greeted Kyle with a distracted handshake, his attention already sliding away, back to the bottle of rosé sweating on the terrace table. "The prodigal son's keeper," Jordan had sighed, not unkindly, just stating a fact. "Make yourself at home. Just don't bother me before noon." Kira was the complication. Jordan's fiancée moved through the chateau with a quiet feline grace. Her eyes, the color of shale, missed nothing. She watched Kyle unpack his single, modest suitcase. She noted how his gaze lingered on a particular landscape painting, how his fingers traced the spine of a book in the library, not with reverence, but with a kind of hungry recognition. "You're not like the usual help Caleb sends," she said to him one evening, her voice a low murmur in the twilight. It was not a compliment. It was a calibration. Kyle's task was simple: ensure Jordan returned to New York for the gala. But as days bled into weeks, the simple task hurtled into something else. He watched Jordan's life, a life of such staggering casual abundance it was almost an insult. He saw the boredom in it, the waste, and a cold, clear thought formed in Kyle's mind, as sharp and definitive as a diamond. I could do this better. The first lie was small. A friend of Jordan's called some baron's son, with a slurred voice. Kyle, answering the phone, simply said, "He's unavailable." The voice asked who he was. "Kyle," he said. There was a pause. "New friend?" the voice asked. Kyle looked out at the pool, where Jordan slept face down on a float. "Something like that," he said, and the lie tasted sweet, like stolen fruit. He began to mirror, then to merge. He adopted Jordan's careless posture, his specific laugh. He offered opinions on wines he'd read about, on places he'd only seen through Jordan's photos. The friends, a rotating cast of beautiful, vacant faces, accepted him. He was a novelty, Jordan's quiet American shadow who sometimes said amusingly perceptive things. Only Kira remained unmoved. She would find him in the library, having slipped away from the terrace chatter. "You read a lot for a logistics manager," she observed. He held up the book, a volume on French maritime history. "Jordan's interested in this," Kyle said. "He asked me to summarize it." The lie came so easily now it felt like truth. The discovery in the boathouse was the first true crack in the fantasy. Kyle had gone to find a missing champagne bucket. The small stone building smelled of damp wood and motor oil. And there, tucked behind a rusted-out old speedboat, was a leather satchel. Inside were passports, French, Canadian, Swiss, all with Jordan's photo but different names. Bundles of euros. A handgun, small and dark and terrible. And a single, creased photograph of a woman who was not Kira, holding a child. Kyle's hands were steady as he replaced everything. The chill he felt was not from the damp. Jordan was not just a spoiled heir. He was a man with an exit strategy. Or several. That night, during a dinner with a pair of Italian friends who spoke of skiing in Chile, Kyle watched Jordan. He saw the nervous tap of a finger against crystal, the too quick smile, the way his eyes flicked to the window as if expecting an unwelcome guest. The prince was afraid, and a frightened prince, Kyle understood, was a vulnerable one. The plan did not feel like a plan so much as an inevitable unfolding. It began with suggestion. "Your father sounded quite firm on the phone, Jordan," Kyle said one morning as Jordan nursed a hangover with black coffee. "He mentioned freezing the accounts if you weren't on the New York flight." This was a lie. Caleb had said no such thing. But panic, Kyle knew, made people pliable. Jordan's head snapped up. "He can't do that." "He can, and he will, unless you show good faith." Kyle leaned forward, his voice a confidential murmur. "Send me ahead. Let me smooth things over. I'll talk to him, to the event planners. I'll be your advance man. You follow in a week, tanned and relaxed. The prodigal son returns on his own terms. He sold it as a rebellion, when it was, in fact, a coup." Jordan, relieved, agreed. He handed over documents, credit cards Kyle would need for arrangements. He even gave him a signet ring, a heavy old thing with the family crest. "Show this to my father's secretary," Jordan said. "She knows what it means." Kyle slid the ring onto his finger. It fit as if it had been waiting for him. In New York, in the monolithic silence of Caleb Van Alder's penthouse, Kyle was perfection. He was contrite on Jordan's behalf, efficient, humble, yet insightful. Caleb, a man who valued results over sentiment, grunted his approval. "He finally shows some sense, sending you." The gala preparations consumed Kyle. He chose menus, approved floral arrangements, studied the guest list. He moved into a suite in the Van Alder-owned hotel, paid for with a company card. When he called the chateau to update Jordan, the phone rang and rang into the vast, indifferent European silence. The news came not from France, but from a New York detective, a man named Alvarez, with tired eyes and a voice that held no tone at all. Jordan Van Alder had been found in the boathouse. The single, dark gunshot wound was not in the detective's careful phrasing, consistent with self-infliction. Kira was missing. So was the satchel of passports and money. The world constricted, then exploded. Caleb Van Alder, shrouded in a grief that seemed largely composed of fury, turned to Kyle. "You were the last one to see him. You know his life there." It was not a question. Kyle, his face a mask of stunned horror, nodded. He offered every detail. The nervousness, the unknown woman in the photo, the boathouse where he'd once gone to fetch a bucket. He painted a picture of a Jordan entangled in dangerous things, a victim of his own reckless orbit. He was the loyal retainer, the sole bridge between a grieving father and a sordid, distant tragedy. The gala became a memorial. Kyle stood at Caleb's shoulder, a pillar of quiet support. He wore a tuxedo that belonged to Jordan, altered to fit his slimmer frame. He accepted condolences with a grave nod. Kira's friends, a flock of glittering, confused women, clasped his hands. "You'll find who did this," one whispered, her eyes bright with tears and champagne. He squeezed her hand, saying nothing. And then Kira returned. She appeared at the penthouse a week after the gala, pale as a wraith, a cut healing on her temple. Her story was a fragile thing. She'd been away in Milan. She'd heard the news. She'd been in shock, hiding. She looked at Kyle, who now occupied the guest wing, who moved through the apartment with a familiar ease, and her shale-colored eyes turned to flint. "You," she said, the single word loaded with a universe of accusation. Their conversations were duels with blunt rapiers. "Trusted you," she said, finding him in the study one evening. "He barely knew me," Kyle replied, looking up from the financial reports he was studying for Caleb. "That's what I mean," she said. and left the room, leaving behind the scent of her perfume and a silence that screamed. The authorities were a low, persistent hum. Alvarez asked polite, circular questions. The French police requested clarification. The narrative held, but just barely. Kyle could feel it straining, like a sail in a rising wind. He knew the linchpin was Kira. She had seen something. She knew something. The photo of the woman and child. Had that been Kira's secret, or Jordan's? Was her disappearance flight, or a failed confrontation? He found her on the terrace. The city sprawled below them like a bed of electronic jewels. The night air was cool. She didn't turn as he approached. It was always about belonging, wasn't it? She said, her voice almost lost in the distant sirens. You saw a world you wanted, and you just stepped into it, like putting on a coat. He didn't deny it. It fits me better. Until it doesn't. She finally looked at him. The boathouse was cold that night. I felt that same chill. The window was open. Jordan was always so careless with things. Well, Sheedy took a step closer. He was going to run. With her. With their child. He was going to leave all of this. Leave me. And disappear into one of his new identities. He told me that night to punish me for asking. Her smile was a terrible, broken thing. I didn't kill him, Kyle. I just didn't stop it. The revelation settled between them, not with a shock, but with a dreadful, sinking finality. She had been there. She had seen, and she had let it happen, whether it was suicide or murder by some unknown associate from Jordan's shadow life. Her silence was her guilt, and now it was his weapon. You have no proof of anything, Kyle said, his voice soft. Only a story. A jealous fiancé scorned who fled the scene. Your credibility is gone, Kira. Mine is all that's left. She stared at him, seeing not the ambitious young man, nor the faithful employee, but the final, polished product, the heir. The man who had absorbed Jordan's life, his father, his home, his very identity, through a ruthless act of psychological alchemy. She had allowed a vacuum, and nature, in the form of Kyle, had abhorred it. The next morning, Kira was gone again. This time, a note left for Caleb spoke of overwhelming grief, of needing to escape. It was believable. Caleb, aged a decade and months, simply crumpled the paper. His hand fell on Kyle's shoulder, a heavy possessive weight. You're all I have left, he said, his voice cracking. You're the only one who understands. Time passed. The investigation stalled, then faded. Kyle moved from the guest wing to the master suite. He learned the business. He hosted the parties. He wore the signet ring. He was Jordan Van Alder, in every way that mattered to the world. The lie had not just been told, it had been lived into truth. He had won. But the past is not a room you leave. It is a scent that clings to your clothes. It is a pocket of cold air in a perfectly climate-controlled room. Tonight, in the library of the New York penthouse, that cold persists. It whispers of an open window in a French boathouse, of a decision made in chilling silence. Kyle walks to the window, his reflection a ghost over the dark city. He sees not his own face, but a composite. The ghost of Jordan, the ambition of Kyle, the creation of Caleb's need. He is the author and the protagonist of a magnificent, terrible fiction. He turns, intending to call for the housekeeper to adjust the thermostat, and stops. On the immense, empty desk, centered perfectly on the polished mahogany, lies a single square photograph. It is creased. It shows a woman who is not Kira, holding a child. The child is older now. The woman stares directly at the camera, her expression unreadable. No windows are open. The door has not made a sound. The chill in the room deepens, crawling up his spine, settling in the marrow of his bones. It is the chill of a door left ajar, of a story not yet finished, of an audience of one who knows every line of the play. He picks up the photograph. His hand, for the first time since he stood in a Phoenix warehouse, is trembling. He looks from the haunting image in his hand to the vast, dark lawn beyond the glass, then back again. The air in the library is not right. It hasn't been for a very long time. And he understands, with a clarity that is both absolute and devastating, that the haunting is no longer something he is investigating. It is the condition of his life. The chill is not a clue left behind. It is the atmosphere of the world he built, and it is finally, irrevocably, settling in. The woman in the photograph had Jordan's eyes. The child had his smile. This was not a relic from the boathouse. That photo had been older, faded at the edges. This one was recent, the colors sharp, the child's face fuller. Someone had taken this within the last few months. Someone was keeping track. Kyle's mind, usually a vault of calculated moves, scrabbled for purchase. Kira? Had she found them? Was this her final move, not an accusation, but a delivery? Or was it the woman herself, emerging from whatever shadow Jordan had tucked her into, now seeing her chance? The gun was gone from the boathouse, he remembered. The French police had never logged it. A missing weapon from a death ruled inconclusive. A loose end. He heard the soft click of the library door closing. He hadn't heard it open. He spun, the photograph crinkling in his fist. Caleb Van Alder stood just inside the room, leaning heavily on his polished cane. His face was in shadow, but the light from the hallway etched the sharp lines of his jaw, the hollows of his cheeks. He looked like a monument to his own grief. "Can't sleep either." Caleb's voice was a dry rustle. He took a few steps into the room, his eyes passing over Kyle's clenched hand without comment. "I never liked this room at night. Too many windows. Too much emptiness looking in." Kyle forced his fingers to relax, sliding the photograph onto the desk behind him, face down. "I thought I felt a draft. A malfunction with the system, perhaps." "Perhaps," Caleb echoed. He stopped by the chair where Kyle usually sat, his hand resting on the leather wing. "You've done well, you know. Stepping into the breach, better than I could have hoped for." He paused, his gaze drifting to the dark lawn. A father knows his son, his weaknesses, his failings. Jordan was soft, beautiful but soft. The world would have eaten him alive. In a way, it did. The words hung in the chilled air, laced with a meaning that crept under Kyle's skin. Caleb turned his head, his eyes now fixed on Kyle. They were not the eyes of a grieving, broken man. They were the eyes of a CEO assessing an asset. "I required a correction," Caleb said, his tone conversational, almost gentle. "A recalibration of the future. The boy was a liability. His extracurricular family was a threat to everything built. His choices were leading to ruin, or worse, scandal." He tapped the head of his cane once on the Persian rug. A clean break was necessary. But nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. "Nein, near. Nein, dedan. Arsenanin. Dorisho." Kyle's blood seemed to freeze in his veins, colder than the air by the window. He could not move, could not speak. "You didn't kill my son, Kyle," Caleb continued, as if discussing a minor stock fluctuation. "Some associate from his sordid little double life did that. Or perhaps it was the despair of a weak man facing consequences. The French police settled on the latter, with some gentle guidance. The narrative was clean. It allowed for a dignified end." He took a step closer. "But a narrative requires a next chapter, an heir, a successor. You were my contingency plan. From the moment my man in Phoenix flagged you, your study of Jordan, your hunger, your lack of ties, you were perfect clay." The room tilted. the meticulously constructed reality of the last year. His cunning, his opportunism, his brilliant theft, dissolved like mist. He had not infiltrated a world. He had been invited into a cage. Every step, from the lawyer's call to the ring on his finger, had been a step on a path laid by this old, ruthless man. The photograph, Kyle managed, the words ash in his mouth. A reminder, Caleb said, his voice losing its gentleness, turning to steel, that while you occupy the space my son failed to, you do not own it. I do. There are other branches on this tree, other potential heirs. Your position is not inherited. It's appointed, and it can be rescinded. Shh. Caleb turned and walked slowly back toward the door. He paused on the threshold, a silhouette against the warm light of the hall. Keep the photograph, he said, without looking back. Let it remind you of the chill. It is the chill of expectation, of duty, of my will. Sleep well, Kyle. The door shut softly behind him. Kyle stood alone in the silent, cold library. He looked at the photograph on the desk, then at his reflection in the dark window. The face that stared back was not his own, nor was it Jordan's. It was a mask, crafted by a master, and he had worn it so long he had forgotten his own skin beneath it. He had thought he was the author. He was merely a character, and the final draft had always belonged to Caleb. The air was not right. It was filled with the quiet, absolute control of a man who could orchestrate a death, a succession, and a haunting, all without ever raising his voice. The chill was permanent. It was the climate of his new world, and he would have to learn to live in it forever. He did not sleep. He sat in the leather chair, the photograph on the desk before him, and watched the sky lighten from black to a dull, smudged gray. The city sounds began to filter up, the distant groan of garbage trucks, the first sirens. Normal sounds. They felt like a broadcast from another planet. Caleb's confession had not been a confession at all. It was a deed of ownership, transferred in the night. Kyle's entire ascent was recontextualized, each memory tainted. The lawyer's chance discovery of him, the suspiciously smooth transfer to France. Jordan's erratic behavior. Had Caleb's pressure driven him to those desperate, hidden plans? Had his own father's maneuvers made the boathouse inevitable? And Kira, her flight made a new, grim sense. She hadn't just seen a crime. She had seen the architecture of it, and understood she was looking at a power that could erase her without a ripple. A servant entered at 7 with a pot of coffee, setting it on the sideboard with a quiet nod. The routine was unchanged. The world went on. Kyle showered, dressed in a suit selected by a stylist now on the household payroll, and went down to breakfast. Caleb was already there, reading the Financial Times through antique spectacles. He glanced up. You look tired. The draft kept you up, I suppose. Yes, Kyle said, taking his seat. I'll have the engineers look at it. See it you do. Caleb turned a page. The board meeting is at 10. I've added you to the agenda for the Singapore expansion review. Be prepared. Henderson will try to poke holes. He's old guard. Doesn't like change. It was a normal conversation of a grooming a son. The horror of the night before was sealed under a layer of mundane ice. Kyle realized this was the true discipline required of him. Not the performance of being Jordan, but the acceptance of being Caleb's instrument. To live with the knowledge and never blink. The board meeting was a theater of subdued power. Kyle presented the figures, answered Henderson's barbed questions with calm precision. He felt Caleb's gaze on him measuring. Afterward, as the room emptied, Caleb approached. You handled Henderson well. You let him exhaust himself, then presented the closing data. It's a subtle art. Thank you, Kyle said. Subtlety is survival, Caleb said, his hand resting briefly on Kyle's shoulder. The touch was proprietary. Remember that. In the days that followed, Kyle began to see the strings. A memo from legal about discreetly resolving a potential claimant issue that bore a striking resemblance to the woman in the photograph. A security briefing that mentioned routine surveillance on a residential address in Montreal. Caleb was not just managing a corporation. He was managing the narrative, pruning the family tree with quiet, legal ruthlessness. Kyle was now part of the pruning mechanism. He found himself walking through the penthouse at night, not as its master, but as its chief attendant. He would stop before portraits of Van Alder ancestors, stern men and composed women who knew nothing of Phoenix warehouses or logistical reports. Their painted eyes seemed to hold a cold amusement. You are just the latest steward, they seemed to say. The blood is the thing, and you have none. The photograph he kept in a locked drawer of the desk. He did not look at it often, but he knew it was there. It was his own personal chill, a counterpoint to Caleb's overarching frost. It represented the chaos Caleb sought to control, the human fallout that could still potentially surge up and upset the elegant, terrible order. One afternoon, a plain envelope arrived by private courier. No return address. Inside was a key and a slip of paper with an address in Tribeca and a time, 8 p.m. dawn. The handwriting was a controlled, feminine script he did not recognize. He considered not going. He considered showing it to Caleb, a test of loyalty. But a deeper instinct, a remnant of the man who had once seized an opportunity, told him to go alone. This was a move outside the board. A wild card. The address led to a loft in a converted warehouse. He used the key. The space was mostly empty, white-walled, with vast windows overlooking the Hudson. A single chair sat in the center of the room. Kira stood by the window, her back to him. "You're late," she said without turning. "I didn't know I had an appointment." "You do now." She finally faced him. She looked older, sharper, stripped of her previous glitter. She wore simple black. "Owns you, doesn't he? He told you." Kyle said nothing. It was confirmation enough. "I thought I was so clever," she said, a bitter laugh escaping her. "I thought my silence was a weapon, but he knew I'd run. He counted on it. My disappearance made the story neater. The hysterical fiancé. It played right into his hands." "Man, why come back?" Kyle asked. "Why risk this?" "Because I am not the only one who knows," she said, stepping closer. "The woman, Elara. She knows about Jordan. She knows about the child. And she is not a fool. She's been waiting. Now she sees you, a stranger, wearing her lover's life. She won't be managed by lawyers and private investigators forever." "What do you want, Kira?" "I want a life," she said, her voice cracking for the first time. "One he can't reach. I have resources he doesn't know about. Jordan gave me things before the end. But I need a diversion, a permanent one." Kyle understood. She wanted Caleb's focus elsewhere. She wanted him looking at the looming threat of Elara and the legitimate heir, so she could slip away into a new identity, funded by Jordan's secret stashes. "You're asking me to betray him." "You can't betray a man who sees you as a tool," she spat. "You can only become useless, and then you'll end up like Jordan, or me, or in a shallow grave with a corporate excuse etched on your headstone." And she took a deep breath. "Help me ensure Elara becomes his primary problem, not with violence, with information. A nudge, then we both get a chance. You to rule your gilded cage in peace, me to escape mine." She handed him a small, encrypted drive. "Everything I have on her. Locations, habits, the child's school. It's a starting point. You decide what to do with it. You can give it to Caleb and prove your loyalty, or you can let it slip into her hands. Let her know the full might of the Van Alder Empire is now personified by you, a man with no right to it." She will come for you, and while she does, I vanish. Manish, day now. Kyle took the drive. It was warm from her hand. It felt like the first real choice he'd been offered in over a year. A choice between two types of servitude: loyal instrument to a ruthless king, or permanent guardian against a rightful queen, in a war orchestrated by a discarded princess. He left the loft without another word. On the street, the city noise was a roar. He put the drive in his pocket. It felt heavier than the signet ring. Back in the library, the chill was waiting. He sat at the desk, the drive, and the photograph before him. 2 women, 2 threats, 2 paths. Caleb's voice echoed in his memory. Subtlety is survival. He looked at the child's face in the photograph. The boy who, by blood, should be sitting in this chair. Kyle's hand went to the keyboard. He inserted the drive. Files opened. He saw a life, detailed and vulnerable. He saw a chance. He did not forward the files to Caleb's security chief. He did not delete them. He composed a new, anonymous email account. His fingers hovered over the keys. The chill in the room was no longer just Caleb's will, or the ghost of Jordan. It was the precipice of his own. He had wanted a world. Now he had to learn how to rule it, and that meant knowing when to share a secret, when to create a rival, and when to let 2 wolves circle each other, while he, the shepherd, decided which one to feed. He began with a single photograph. Not the one from the desk, but a different one from Kira's files. A candid shot of Ilara and the boy in a park, smiling. He attached no message. He sent it from the anonymous account to a secure private email he found buried in the data. When he guessed, she checked herself. A ping on the radar. A proof of knowledge. The response was not immediate. For a week, nothing changed. Caleb presided over dinners, discussed mergers, and the chill in the library remained a constant, unmentioned companion. Kyle performed his duties, but his mind was a split screen. One half focused on the corporate minutiae, the other tracking the silent digital space where he had cast a stone. The reply came on a Tuesday, a single line from a new, anonymous address. Who are you? He waited 2 days, then sent another image. This one was of the Van Alder building, its apex lit against the night sky. He followed it with text. The man in your son's place. This time, the reply was faster. What do you want? Kyle leaned back in his chair, the blue light of the screen washing over his face. This was the delicate part. He had to plant the idea without seeming to plant it. He had to make her move without directing her. He typed, I want stability. The current management wants erasure. You are a threat to that stability. I am not your enemy, but I am not your friend. I am a fact. Not on me. Chibang. He hit send before he could second-guess the wording. It was a gambit, positioning himself as a neutral party, a mere administrator, when in truth he was the usurper. He needed her to see Caleb as the primary architect of her misfortune, and himself as a potentially malleable obstacle. Her next message was longer. It contained a date, a time, and the name of a cafe in Montreal. Come alone. I will know if you don't. He could not go to Montreal. His movements were tracked, if not by Caleb directly, then by the security apparatus that served him. An unexplained trip would raise flags. Instead, he sent the address of a small, discreet art gallery in Soho, and a time 3 days later. New York is my ground. You be safe. A public place. We will each bring one person, a show of good faith. He expected a refusal. He received a single word. Agreed. Kira had asked for a diversion. He was creating a summit. The risk was monumental. If Caleb discovered this, it would be seen as the ultimate betrayal. Negotiating with the legitimate heir, Kyle was beginning to understand the true geometry of power. Caleb held all the official cards. Ilara held the moral blood right card. Kyle held only the card of presence. To survive, he had to make himself the essential pivot between them. The day of the meeting, he told his assistant he was visiting a potential gallery for the corporate collection. A pet project had floated to Caleb weeks ago. It was a thin cover, but it would suffice for a few hours. He